From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Russia spent a third night on Wednesday attacking the Ukrainian port city of Odessa, a brutal assault aiming to break the country's ability to export food after the Black Sea grain deal fell apart. In Washington, a narrative is congealing that the Ukrainian counteroffensive is underperforming. But is it accurate, and what can we expect in the coming weeks? Welcome to Potomac Watch. I'm Kate Batchelder Odell, filling in today as your host. Today, we're going to discuss the situation in Ukraine, both on the merits and the politics. I'm joined by my distinguished colleagues on the editorial board, Joe Sternberg and Gillian Melcher, both in London. Welcome to you both. So the Ukrainian port city of Odessa seems to have weathered a very intense barrage overnight, a mix of cruise missiles and drones intended to overwhelm Ukraine's cobbled-together network of air defenses. Some were shot down, but the point appears to have been to hit some infrastructure and prevent the export of food. Gillian, you reported for us earlier this week on this subject. Why don't you walk us through how this Black Sea grain deal fell apart? Russia is now threatening to target civilian ships moving through the area. What does this mean for global food prices, and what does it mean for the war effort more generally?
Well, it's a bit of a mess. I think what Vladimir Putin is trying to do is hold the world's food supply hostage. This Black Sea grain deal, it's been around for about a year. It's allowed the shipment of about 32 million metric tons of food to get out of Ukraine. Ukraine really needs to ship this food out. It doesn't have the rail infrastructure to get it out in sufficient quantities any other way. And Russia knows this. Russia also knows that countries like Egypt, countries like Turkey that have contended with really high food inflation, and even some countries that are undergoing hunger crises depend on Ukrainian food. And so it's trying to use this to extort concessions from the West. And this is a pattern that we've seen since the onset of the grain deal. You know, Putin is saying that this is one-sided, that it only benefits Ukraine, but that's not true. A parallel agreement that was brokered along with the grain initiative, the UN actually agreed to help create unimpeded access for Russian food and fertilizer. Now, what Putin wants now is for the West to give him a pass to allow the state-owned Russian Agricultural Bank to be able to access the SWIFT system that facilitates international payments. But that would basically blow a really big hole in the sanctions regime. And so now you see Putin basically going after the port infrastructure, going after, threatening some of these grain shipments. And I think it's going to cause a real problem. I mean, if you look at the UN estimates, they say that the grain initiative helped keep down food prices in the last year by more than 23%. What we're seeing now is wheat futures up 12% this week in Chicago, corn futures up 8 or 9%. I mean, this is significant. The global market is adjusting to this uncertainty, but I think it's going to hit countries that rely on Ukrainian food very hard. And Putin's also betting that this might be a cause of political instability in some of them.
Sure. I think you're right on the money that it's a play for sanctions relief, and Putin still thinks he can divide the West with his threats to escalate. Joe, I'd ask you, what is the proper response from the U.S. and Europe to this behavior? I mean, Putin has tried to hold these food exports hostage before, and it turned out to be something of a bluff. Is this another? And I guess I'm particularly interested from you and your experience covering Europe. Can the West leverage this opportunity to enlist help from Turkey to get something done on this?
Well, I think the key point is to not give in to the blackmail and to understand that there has been a lot of bluffing on Putin's side of this conflict throughout. And so I think that there are a bunch of options. I mean, one practical option is to continue shipping grain through the Black Sea. I mean, if you have non-Ukrainian vessels trying to sail through whatever Russian blockade Putin might try to put in place around these ports, that creates a real problem for Vladimir Putin. I mean, we're thinking a lot about this in terms of how these situations are a problem for Ukraine or a problem for the West. A lot of the saber rattling also creates problems for Putin himself, because having pulled out of this grain deal, his problem becomes, what is he going to do if other people just continue trying to ship the grain? I think that although that is certainly not a risk-free strategy, it is worth taking the risk and forcing Putin most likely to back down, because it's hard to believe that he is going to be eager to pick the kind of fights that would be involved in actually enforcing a blockade, against any Western countries that wanted to participate in the shipping, which is probably why he is also attacking some of the port infrastructure that will make it difficult to ramp up any of these exports, even if we return to the grain deal in the short term.
Yeah, I think you're right that it is perhaps another bluff, and that he would be taking an enormous risk to open fire on an escort of some of these ships. And I do think NATO has to be prepared to have an operation like that, multi-country coalition escorting some of these ships. I'd add one other idea that I might put to you, Jillian. Seth Cropsey, journal contributor, naval affairs expert, was pointing out this morning that we really need to expedite anti-ship weapons to Ukraine. That is something that Putin shouldn't want to see happen, but we've seen the Ukrainians use anti-ship capabilities somewhat effectively, and this would be a winner for the U.S. I mean, Putin really views his Black Sea fleet as a crown jewel, and diminishing that strategic asset of an adversary would be good for the U.S. Harpoon missiles, naval strike missiles, these are long-range missiles with really devastating precision. Jillian, is that a capability that Ukraine wants? Have you seen any movement toward giving them more ability to defend their coastlines?
The Ukrainians have done some really interesting things with the equipment that they have to target Russia's Black Sea fleet. And you're also starting to see them do some really interesting things with drones and with drone boats. But yeah, we should absolutely be giving them everything that they need to fend off this threat. I mean, I think there's been concern about U.S. stockpiles, and that is somewhat justified. But when you look at the broader issue, some of this equipment, especially equipment that's stationed in Europe, what is it there for? What's its purpose? Its purpose is primarily to defend against the Russian threat. And so I think that if we're providing this equipment in a way that allows the Ukrainians to degrade Russian capabilities for us, it's a bargain. It's a great use of that equipment, and we should certainly be providing it.
Yeah, and I've banged on this point several times, but I'm not sure we can make it enough, because I think the U.S. stocks issue is a live one, but also at the same time, for instance, Taiwan wants Harpoon anti-ship missiles as well, and there's a discussion whether we should provide them to Ukraine if Taiwan needs them. But China's certainly watching the war in Ukraine, and I think can't repeat it enough that if you've got to fight the war that you have and hopefully deter that other conflict from breaking out. But if you pass on helping the Ukrainians, I'm not sure how the U.S. is going to leverage that into success in Asia. I'll switch gears a little bit because I want to talk more broadly about the offensive and how it's going. It's less than 2 months in. We're certainly only getting started, but we have sort of had this discussion that's been quick to declare the Ukrainians as underperforming. General Mark Milley, the U.S. chairman of the Joint Chiefs, responded to some of those claims earlier this week in a press conference. Let's listen real quick to what he had to say earlier this week.
It is far from a failure, in my view. I think that it's way too early to make that kind of call. I think there's a lot of fighting left to go, and I'll stay with what we said before. This is going to be long, it's going to be hard, it's going to be bloody, and at the end of the day, we'll see where the Ukrainians end up vis-a-vis the Russians.
So I'd agree somewhat with that assessment that it is far too early to make that call. The chief of MI6 in Britain pointed out this week that Ukraine liberated more territory in a month than Russia did in a year. And most of the units that have been trained by the West are still being held in reserve. At the same time, there are some real difficulties on the battlefields. One of them is that the Ukrainians are having to clear enormous areas of mines. I think the Ukrainians also have a fair criticism of the West when they say that U.S. reticence in providing weapons gave the Russians a lot of time to lay those mines, to fortify those defenses, trenches, dragon's teeth that have become so hard to break through. But Jillian, you're deeply sourced in the Ukrainian military, and I would be interested in your broad analysis. Are the Ukrainians just being more careful with human life than the Russians? Are they merely just getting started on the real action? Or are they struggling in profound ways that will complicate their ability to take more territory?
Well, I'll put it this way. They are absolutely being vastly more careful with Ukrainian life than Russians are being with Russian lives. Look, this is a really tough battlefield. And, there was an interview that came out a couple weeks ago with Ukraine's General Zelensky. And he was noting that what they are doing is something that the West doesn't really do. I mean, if the United States were going to go into this situation, they would have air support. What we've seen so far is some of the delays in the West providing equipment to Ukraine has put this counteroffensive off longer than it needed to, and really given the Russians a chance to hunker down and to fortify in the ways that you described. So if the United States military were undertaking an operation like this, you would see them using air support. You'd see them using long-range missiles to go in, take out some of the enemy defenses, but also this would have the added benefit of taking out some of those mines that are littering the minefields. When you have an explosion from a missile that's that large, it can detonate some of that. The Ukrainians don't have those capabilities. They're being asked to do something and being put in a situation that American troops would never be put into. And so it's very grinding. You also have to keep in mind the disparity in just manpower. You know, the Russians certainly have their own problems with morale, with recruitment, but the Ukrainians are a smaller population. And so I think they're being very cautious and very strategic about how they use the military and the equipment that they have. I mean, these minefields are tough. It's a really difficult battle. I do think one thing to note is that as exhausting and difficult as this has been for the Ukrainians, it's also been very difficult on the Russians. And that's where that morale problem comes up again. What we're seeing right now is largely a strategy where they are probing for weaknesses on the battlefield while contending with this mine issue. But I think that it's possible that if there is a weakness or if there is a point at which the Ukrainians can push through, you may see a Russian retreat, bringing back the lines. I mean, in some ways, the situation kind of parallels what we saw last fall around Kherson, where the Ukrainians were just putting so much pressure day in and day out on the Russian military that the Russians realized that they couldn't hold some of that and had to do a strategic retreat. I think it's possible that we could see something like that. It's just in many ways too early to say.